Hello there, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of The Period Party. My guest is Deena Emera, an evolutionary geneticist, teacher, and the author of A Brief History of the Female Body, an evolutionary look at how and why the female form came to be. She currently serves as a scientist and writer in residence at the Buck Institute Center for Reproductive Longevity and Equality. And in this thought-provoking conversation, we explore the evolutionary origins of menstruation, shedding light on how the menstrual cycle has evolved over time and the theories surrounding its purpose and function. Deena shares intriguing insights into the evolutionary advantages and adaptations associated with menstruation, revealing its influence on reproductive success in human populations. But we don't stop there. We delve into the phenomenon of menopause, uncovering its evolutionary significance and the impact it has had on human evolution and reproductive strategies. Deena also shares about the intricate adaptations that have shaped pregnancy, such as the development of the placenta and the profound changes in maternal-fetal interactions. We also debunk common misconceptions and myths surrounding the evolution of the female body, and Deena shares the latest research and cutting-edge discoveries in the field of evolutionary biology, including new perspectives on periods, menopause, and pregnancy. I hope you love this episode, and if you do, please feel free to share it on Instagram and other social media outlets, and don't forget to tag me, Nicole M. Jardim. Hi, Deena. Thank you so much for being on the podcast with me.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Nicole.
Yes, I really cannot wait for this conversation. I've been so excited and thinking of all the questions that I have for you. And the very first one is actually, what do you do? What is an evolutionary geneticist?
That is a good question. A lot of people don't know.
Yep.
So I would say the easiest way to think about it is that, I'm interested in kind of like a paleontologist who's interested in sort of the past and how bodies have evolved. But I study that by looking at DNA. So I study that by looking at DNA and genes and whole genomes and comparing those between different species, and then looking at similarities and differences and sort of making inferences about the past based on, the diversity of DNA sequences that I'm seeing today. I actually at some point wanted to be a paleontologist, and I went on a Neanderthal dig in France, and then in graduate school I sort of changed my path a little bit.
Oh, wow. Okay. So wait, why did you change your path? You just wanted to study the
I
human
didn't
body?
want to spend my life like going, all over the world. I mean, it sounds kind of exotic, but like the actual work of a paleontologist is incredibly tedious. Um, and I think you can glean a lot of there are so many insights that you can get just by looking at DNA sequences, and you can do experiments too. Like you can manipulate different genes, in whole animals. So we do a lot of sort of genetic manipulations in mice, so you could just do a lot of cool stuff by looking at DNA. So you can put, like, one of the projects I did was putting the human version of a gene into the mouse, like replacing the human version with the, replacing the mouse version with the human version and looking to see what happens to their body. So there's lots of cool stuff that you can do sort of using genetics as sort of the tool.
Right. And wait a second. So what's the difference between an evolutionary geneticist and an evolutionary biologist? Or are you guys kind of the same?
I mean, I sometimes will describe myself as a biologist too. I think the key is that I'm sort of looking at DNA versus other types of, evidence like bones. It's just a little bit, the geneticist part just makes it a little bit more precise. But I consider myself both an evolutionary geneticist and an evolutionary biologist. My degree is in evolutionary biology.
Right. Okay. You are so cool. I don't know any evolutionary
Thank you.
biologists or geneticists. So you've written this amazing book. Everyone, you need to go out and buy this book. It is so good. It's called A Brief History of the Female Body. And I'm curious why you decided to write it. Was there a particular thing that happened that made you super interested in the female body, like me and all the rest of us?
I mean, the story is, that the idea came a long time ago. So it was when I was getting my PhD. Um, I was studying the evolution of pregnancy, and sort of the genetics of that. So, like, what were sort of the genetic changes that were happening in mammals that let them all of a sudden like stop laying eggs and start, you know, giving birth to live babies and having them develop in our bodies. So, anyway, I was doing all that, studying the evolution of pregnancy, and I was actually going through my first pregnancy. And there were so many moments as I was studying for my qualifying exams where I was like, wow, this stuff is mind blowing. Like, I think other women would want to know this, just this deep context of why our pregnancies are so difficult. Why we have so, for some women it's they have a hard time getting pregnant. For some women, they worry about diabetes, they worry about high blood pressure during pregnancy. So I was just learning all this mind-blowing stuff, and I was like, oh my gosh, I should write a book. Now, that was my oldest son is almost 14, so that was a long time ago. um
It's a
yeah,
process.
so
Someone
I
who's written
did
a book, it
well,
is
I didn't
totally a
start
process.
writing it. I didn't start writing it until many years later. And, the timing of it was just serendipitous. But what's so cool, I think, about the timing is that we're at this really, I don't know, awesome moment right now where women are demanding more information about their bodies. Taboos are being broken. We're talking about our periods. We're talking about menopause. Famous people are doing it. Oprah is talking about menopause. Like, I think so. It's a little bit of luck that, the timing worked out because, I started writing it, I don't know, 3 years ago. It takes a while to write a book and a book proposal and all of that. But I think the timing is kind of perfect because we're really at this wonderful moment where there's this, thirst for knowledge. And it's not just, I mean, everyone is now starting to talk about these things. I think my perspective is a little bit unique because, I'm not just talking about what's happening in our bodies while we're having a period, while we're experiencing menopause. Really, I'm addressing like the deeper questions about why certain traits, especially the weird ones, the puzzling ones, like why are those happening at all?
Right.
So it's like the long story of, our bodies. And, why is that important? I think knowledge is power. I think understanding that story helps us live, the healthiest and sort of most vibrant life that we can. And, um, this comes up in my book, quite a bit about, how important it is to understand that history so that we can make better choices about how we live today. And honestly, I mean, the punchline is, the way I live my life is I keep it really basic because I think that our ancestors had very basic lives, get outside, move your body, watch what you eat. They were not eating the stuff that our kids and we are eating today. So it's nothing earth shattering, but I think taking, our culture just has evolved so quickly and our bodies don't evolve that fast. So our bodies are still thinking that we're living 100,000 years ago, but we're exposed to so much stress, so much computer time, like we're spending so much time on our phones scrolling versus being outside.
Yeah.
So
You kind of answered the question I wanted to ask you about why we should care about the history of the female body and the evolution of it. And we're going to get into all the juicy things about that. But yeah, I feel like when we have an understanding of where we came from, we have more compassion for how our bodies are responding to the current state of affairs. And modern society is really incongruent with our biology is what it feels like to me, just based on my experience working in this industry for the last 10 years and working with so many women, and just this feeling that you have to take great measures to be well and stay healthy now.
absolutely. I think you're totally right. And, um, you know, I think a big part of it is also the support. Like, I think it's so awesome that people like you and, others now are having these conversations and supporting each other. Our ancestors, were living in these smaller groups and they were getting support, right? And they had models for, how am I supposed to breastfeed? How am I, what am I supposed to do? They had someone physically helping them, and we are just so alone in all of this.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yes, that's so true. So, switching gears a little bit to talk about menstruation, because, obviously it's the period party. You talked about in your book that we are one of about 5,000 species of placental mammals, but we're one of just a few of these types of mammals who menstruate. And I think there was probably, I think maybe you said in your book it was about 80, which, is not a few, obviously, but, it's a small number, 80 of us
yeah.
that menstruate. So, what is the evolutionary significance of menstruation in humans, or is there one?
Yeah. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. So you're asking the right person. Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing that like an evolutionary biologist does is look and see who has the trait, right? So you mentioned 80 species. Most of those species are primates, which is not surprising. We're primates and you often share traits with people or animals that you're closely related to. So, the primates is one category, makes sense. But then there are these other random species, a couple of bats, the elephant shrew, which is related to elephants. And then, like, the latest species discovered to menstruate is the Egyptian spiny mouse. So it's like the only rodent that menstruates. It's really wild.
So random to me, though. So many different groups.
Yes.
What is
Yes.
that?
It's totally random. And of course, like, people have been thinking about this for a long time. Evolutionary biologists in particular and anthropologists have puzzled over it. Like, why do we menstruate? And I think, like, in the 90s, when the conversation was starting, people wanted to ascribe like an adaptive function to menstruation. They wanted to say, okay, menstruation has a purpose. And, there have been lots of ideas. I think most of them have been debunked at this point. I can talk about a couple of them. So the first idea was put out by Margie Prophet, and she came up with kind of an interesting thought, which was that menstruation evolved to basically flush out any bacteria and other pathogens that come into our bodies during intercourse. Kind of makes sense, sort of intuitive.
I feel like
But
people
then
still
another
talk about that, by the way. They still say things like that. So I am curious if that is completely debunked or if that's kind of a thing.
As far as I'm concerned, it's been debunked. So
Okay.
another biologist named Beverly Strassman, like, explicitly tested the hypothesis by doing all these different tests. And basically, what you would expect if that were true is fewer pathogens in our bodies after we get our period than before we get our period. And that's not what we found, or that's not what she found. Um, and, she did some other tests as well, and nothing really supported that idea.
Mm.
So Beverly Strassman, who's actually still active in this field, and she's studying something really cool now, which is the effect of hormonal birth control on cancer rates. Anyway, we maybe we'll have time to get into that later.
Oh,
But
yeah.
she came up with a different idea, which was that menstruation evolved as a way to save energy. So, I'm sure that your listeners know some basics about periods, but basically what happens every month is that our uterus builds itself up, and then it almost, the way I think about it is that it transforms into like a structure that can support a pregnancy. So it's, in the second half of our cycles, our uterus is basically getting ready for a potential pregnancy. And if you don't get pregnant, the lining is shed. And that happens because our progesterone levels drop. When we get pregnant, our progesterone levels stay elevated, but if you don't get pregnant, they drop. And that lining, once it's transformed, needs progesterone. So if levels drop, the lining is shed. And so what Strassman said was that you save a lot of energy shedding the lining versus just keeping it in that state of pregnancy the whole month, right? So that sounded kind of cool. And then she like actually measured the amount of energy that it saved. The problem, and another biologist, he was a vet, pointed out some like a major flaw in the logic there, which is, the uterus is not just doing one thing, it's doing lots of things over the course of our cycle. One of the key ones, obviously, for pregnancy is that it's letting sperm in.
Right.
And, keeping that uterus in sort of the transformed state of pregnancy makes it really hard to get pregnant. And actually, the non-menstruating mammals don't actually do that. So that hypothesis was flawed. I think when I started studying this question, when I was getting my PhD, as sort of a side project, is looking at, we talked about the random collection of primates and other mammals that menstruate. And they have a number of things in common, but one of them I think is the key traits. So I mentioned we build our uterine lining up every month, then we transform it. If we get pregnant, we're good to go. If we don't get pregnant, the lining is shed. Most mammals don't do that. Most mammals, they get pregnant and then they transform their uterus for pregnancy. They only do that once they're pregnant. Menstruating mammals do it differently. They basically prep every cycle, whether or not they're pregnant. It's like the control of their uterus is now their own. Like that control is now, the mother is doing it, instead of waiting for the baby to do it. So all of that to say, I actually don't think menstruation is the trait that we should really be talking about, because that's just a side effect. Basically, menstruation is kind of like a mini version of having a baby. Like when you have a baby at the end of pregnancy, the same stuff happens. The lining is shed, progesterone levels, it's a little bit different in humans, but basically progesterone signaling stops happening the same way that it happens at the end of a period. I'm sorry, the end of a cycle. It also happens at the end of pregnancy. So basically the real trait is, why do some mammals do all of that work to get their uterus ready for pregnancy? Because sometimes, in humans, like most cycles, we're not getting pregnant. So I think that's the question.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting that you brought this up, because I bet there are so many women listening right now being like, seriously, why? Why are we doing this to ourselves every single month? Especially as what we said earlier about it being so hard to stay healthy in the modern world, and that those health issues often manifest as period related, menstrual cycle related problems. So yeah, it's a whole thing, but I am curious about that. Like, maybe we can talk about how it's evolved. Like, how has our menstrual cycle changed? Because I know you talked about the Ice Age girl in your book, and the modern day woman, and how has it shifted?
Yeah, I think that's another great question, because, we can't help as women, living our lives, we can't help but think about periods the way that we're experiencing them, right? Like, and the truth is that I think our ancestors had a very different experience with their periods. And some of this we know by studying, hunter-gatherer tribes, people who live differently than, those of us who live in Connecticut and, San Francisco. So their lives are very different. And so you can kind of study. This is one of the things Beverly Strassman has done. She's studying, different tribes, and looking to see how they experience their periods, how many periods. So that's one kind of critical thing, is that, we get a lot of periods, right? I mean, we are cycling 400 times in our lifetime, 500 times in our lifetime. But those women in that like tribe in Mali who are living very different lives than we are, they're always pregnant. They're always nursing. So they only have about 100 cycles. So that's one thing, like they're getting fewer periods, or, our ancestors were likely getting many fewer periods. Another thing to consider is like how bad a period is, or, PMS symptoms, our whole experience during any given cycle. I think that our ancestors probably didn't experience periods the way that we are now. I think, going back to diet and lifestyle, I think, we in the modern world, we move a lot less than we did in the past. I mean, women in the past were constantly moving, constantly looking for food, always on the move. Today, we move a lot less. We also eat more. The quality of our diets is not, our bodies are not evolved to deal with the amount of sugar and fat that we're putting into our body. So, one of the consequences of that, I think, is that our levels of reproductive hormones are much higher than they probably were in our ancestral, mothers. And I think that translates into a lot of things, like worse PMS symptoms is one thought. Longer periods is another thought. So people like Beverly Strassman have done studies comparing symptoms and the length of the period. And they're different in different groups around the world. And, one of the thoughts is it's tied to hormone levels, which is tied to lifestyle and diet.
Right. Interesting. This actually made me think of this conversation that's come up so many times in my work. And it came up recently again because someone I trained with, Dr. Sarah Gottfried, many years ago, she was on Andrew Huberman's podcast a couple of months ago. And the conversation around oral contraceptives helping to prevent certain types of cancer that was brought up. And so the conversation was around the literature showing that those with less ovulatory cycles have a lower risk of certain cancers. And I commented talking about the fact that I really just wish that we could all cycle normally, have our natural menstrual cycles, not be messed with all the time, because in my work, again, this is what I see a lot of, right? We're interrupting these normal menstrual cycles when we actually need these hormones for optimal health. Anyways, people were really mad at me because they were like, but this is potential cancer prevention if we're using oral contraceptives to stop the number of ovulatory cycles. And a lot of people quoted evolutionary biology as being the source of this information. So I was really curious to ask you about whether in your travels you've come across this idea that because our ancestors had less ovulatory cycles, they had lower risks of certain cancers than our modern day counterparts.
Yeah, I mean, I think breast cancer for sure. There's solid evidence that because our ancestors experienced fewer cycles, they were just having, what's happening in the uterus is, some of the same things are happening in the breast, where every cycle, our breast cells are dividing, and every time a cell divides, there's more of a chance for, a cancerous cell to sort of, get that additional mutation it needs to, develop into a cancer. That said,
it's very nuanced, right?
Well,
lots of
my
contributing factors.
understanding is that oral contraception decreases the risk of breast cancer, but it increases the risk of other cancers. So it's not, there's not a simple solution here. And I think, bigger picture, it's kind of infuriating that we don't have more research on this, and this is one of the things that Strassman is studying. Like, there's so many different pills out there that have different, different formulas, right? But we don't know, is this formula better than this one? And, are there more, types of cancer on this formula than on this one? Like, we don't have that information.
Right.
Yeah, I would say, I think we need more data. And I don't disagree with you. I do think, natural cycles do give us a lot of information about overall health of our bodies. I don't disagree there. I think, um, me personally, I'm wary of, messing with things happening in my body.
Yes. And I think my whole thing is, how do we definitively know? And we don't, because like you said, we don't have the research to really prove this. How do we definitively know that it's our sex hormones that are causing these problems and not some other thing?
Yeah.
Our maybe our estrogen detoxification pathways, through our liver and our gut that
Mm,
are more problematic and are definitely an issue with today's modern lifestyle. So that's
yeah.
my whole thing. Is it really the hormones? And is it that there are too many of them all the time versus, a couple thousand years ago when our ancestors weren't ovulating as consistently? I feel like they're just, like I said, it's so nuanced.
Yes, it is definitely nuanced. And my understanding of the literature is that, oral contraception, it does decrease risk of some cancers, but increases the risk of others. So I don't think there's like a silver bullet answer here.
Right. Yes, I agree. I know. I think so too. And I feel like,
Yeah.
yeah, there's lots of contributing factors.
Yeah.
Um, So, as it relates to menstruation or ovulation or anything related to the menstrual cycle, is there anything else that is so fascinating that you want us to know about it as it's evolved over the years? I feel like there's probably a lot of things, but I'm just wondering if
Oh
you
my
have a few
gosh.
things.
Um, I think for me, one of the most interesting sort of areas of research, how do I explain this? So, our reproductive systems evolved in conjunction with our babies. So, we're placental mammals. We have this very intimate connection between mom and baby during pregnancy and also during lactation. And this required like unbelievable changes in both mom and baby over evolutionary timescales. The first mammals laid eggs. I actually just posted a photo of a platypus. It wasn't a platypus, it was an echidna puggle hatching out of an egg. Echidnas are mammals. So the first mammals laid eggs. And when they hatch, they look like embryos, basically.
Right.
Um, Same thing with marsupial babies. Marsupials do give birth to live babies, but they're, the babies that are born look like embryos. So placental mammals are like truly fascinating to me. In that we have these much longer pregnancies. When our babies are born, they look like babies, like some human babies are need a lot of care after birth, and that has to do with the size of our brains when we're born. But like other placental mammals, like a giraffe, like gets up and walks around. All those farm animals, they just get up and walk around right after birth. Like they're very developed. So for all that to happen, there needed to be some changes in the mom. Most of these changes were in the uterus, and then also changes in the baby. Um, and so I guess sort of the most mind-blowing thing that I sort of came across as I was doing research on, the evolution of our reproductive systems is obviously we have to cooperate with our babies, right? I mean, for a successful pregnancy to take place, the mom and baby need to agree on how it's going to work. And, the fetus evolved the placenta essentially. So the placenta is made by the fetus. So the placenta is evolving, but the mother's uterus has to agree on letting that placenta in, right? And so obviously there's this cooperative nature, cooperative relationship between mothers and babies, not just during pregnancy, but also after birth. Like, a baby needs to know how to latch onto the breast and suckle. A mother's body needs to know how to produce milk and when to produce it and all of that. Probably the most mind-blowing thing for me was learning, though, that because we're not genetically identical with our children, there is a conflict of interest. And because the connection during pregnancy is so intimate physically, it's like a great place for this conflict to sort of play out. So pregnancy is so surprising. Human pregnancy in particular, like there's so many instabilities that you would think would never exist because, it has to work, right? Like the animals that survived like needed to make it through a pregnancy. But because of this conflict of interest, there's all kinds of wild things happening during pregnancy, just off the top of my head, like our hormone levels during pregnancy are extremely high, like much higher than actually is necessary for those hormones to do what they need to do. And part of that is because of this conflict of interest. Basically, the baby is trying to manipulate the mother to give that baby as much nutrients as possible. The mother obviously wants the baby to survive, but it's not happening consciously, but the mothers that did better were the ones that sort of moderated access to those resources. The ones that did better had more babies, essentially. And so if they're going to give it all to this one baby, they're not going to have another one, or they're not going to have another one for a very long time. So I don't know. I just find this conflict of interest really interesting, partially because a lot of this stuff like plays out in your living room. Like the stuff I'm describing is happening at like the genetic level over evolutionary timescales. So um, you know, it's a very, it what am I trying to say? It's something that we can study in the lab. It's something that we, can see happening at the genetic level, but it's like playing out in my living room every day, like my kids fighting with each other, me like constantly feeling like my kids are sucking the life out of me, like during pregnancy and after they were born. So anyway, I find it super interesting. And that was like one of the things I was learning during my PhD that I was like, wow, this is so cool and fascinating. And yeah, I do think the evolutionary story is important to get out there, but it's also just so cool. The stuff that's happening, or that has happened in the past.
I mean, it really is. It's like we were talking about in the beginning. You can't really know what the reason is for any of this stuff without really understanding a little bit of the history of it. And that actually makes me think about menopause. I was curious. Menopause is unique to humans, right? To human females? Or does it
Menopause
exist in
is
other
in
animals?
well, in the primates, it's unique to human females. But there are a few other species that have menopause. Strangely, they're all toothed whales. um, Again, yeah, like the distribution of these traits is really interesting, and we can use that to our advantage, I think, because you can look at sort of other traits they have in common, to give you sort of hints as to why certain traits like menopause, like periods, evolved. Um, so yeah, the whales that have menopause are killer whales. So killer whales are cool. We know the most about them. They have very similar lifespan to humans. They basically experience menopause in their 40s, 50s, similar to us, and they live into their 90s. And then some other species, beluga whales, narwhals, short-finned pilot whales is one. Yeah, the menopause question is a big one. It's kind of a puzzling trait. Evolution is all about survival and reproductive success, right? Like the individuals that do better have more babies because they're passing on more of their genes and the traits that are involved in allowing those individuals to have more babies. Um, and so it's really puzzling why any species would have where the females would basically stop reproducing halfway through their life. Like that doesn't make any sense. And that's why it's so rare for sure. Um, I mean, I could go on and on about menopause. I will say at least one piece of the story we think, has to do with sort of the social life in some of these different species. So, one of the prevailing ideas, it's called the grandmother hypothesis. I think it's only part of the story, but the idea is that, um, in ancestral human groups, grandmothers were going through menopause, but then they continued living, and they played a really big role in their grandchildren's life. So they were basically helping their daughters and their sons feed those grandchildren. And that actually freed the mother up from then having more of her own kids. So, I do think menopause is sort of not really menopause, but like a long life after menopause. is sort of part of a suite of traits in humans and probably in these other social whales, that, in our case, it really contributed to the success of humans. We live longer, we cooperate socially, there's a division of labor in human groups. And so I think all of that, our grandparents are, at least back in the day, were very involved in family life. That allowed a human mother to have more kids and have them at shorter intervals. That's like a classic life history trait in humans is, a chimp weans its baby at 5. A human mother who's not, taking birth control, who's just having, her babies naturally, without birth control, she's weaning her kid at 2. So that translates into babies being born at much shorter intervals, which of course contributes to population growth. I think it's part of a bunch of traits that contributed to our success as a species. I think there were probably other things going on other than like grandmas helping their grandkids survive, because there are some species like elephants, elephant grandmothers. Elephants are very social, just like humans. Elephant grandmothers are known to help their grandchildren survive. So they're playing an important role as matriarchs in these elephant groups, but they don't go through menopause. They keep having babies. So I think the story is complex. I wish I had like a very clear answer here. I think grandmothering was part of it. I think there are other things that were probably going on.
Right.
You can read my book to find out what those are.
There you go. And so did our ancestors just not live long enough to go into menopause? I hear that a lot too, out on social
I think
media.
that's
Yeah.
I think that's definitely been a thing and a source of a lot of confusion and debate. I think part of the confusion stems from sort of life expectancy averages that you hear. Like you hear that, 100 years ago, the average lifespan was 40 or 50 years. Now it's 80 years. And so in people's minds, they're thinking, wow, we live twice as long as people did 100 years ago. But that is definitely misleading.
Yeah.
So I would say that one of the things that modern medicine has done is it's stopped kids from dying when they're really young. And, if you take an average, if you've got all of these babies dying at a young age, that drives, average life expectancy way down. So I think there's lots of evidence that humans have been living longer for quite a long time. We don't know exactly how long. And it probably wasn't this overnight thing. But I think there's plenty of evidence that, this is one of the things by looking at sort of hunter gatherers that are still living today. Those women, a huge proportion of the women in those groups are living into their 60s, into their 70s. So this is not just like a modern phenomenon. This is not a side effect of modern medicine and sanitation. I think humans have been living longer for a while.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful because I feel like there's definitely confusion around that. And I hear this all the time. So I'm glad you clarified that. Are there,
well, and let me interject one more thing. Obviously, killer whales, like, they're not humans. They're not going to the doctor. They're not, but they have menopause. So it's obviously a trait that can evolve, right? It's not, it's not just, an artifact of sort of modern life. Something that evolves naturally in other species.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. So, yeah, I'm just thinking about it and I feel like, doesn't it have something to do with the fact that, our bodies start to break down. And so it becomes more and more difficult to sustain a pregnancy for as long as we have to and various other things, I would imagine.
I think that's probably part of the story. I think humans have really hard pregnancies, and childbirth in particular is really hard. And people have studied this. I don't think that's an answer all on its own. I think, there were probably many factors at play, and maybe that was one of them.
Right.
It's just the risk of maternal death as we get older. It does go up, but it doesn't go up like so much that that could explain it.
Right.
One thing I haven't said, the whole reason that menopause is even an issue for us is that we make all our eggs up front. So we make all our eggs during fetal development. Obviously, males don't do this. Like males continue making sperm like after puberty until death, really.
Hmm.
They slow down, and there's all sorts of problems, but in the quality of their sperm as they get older, but they keep making it. And so really, like, when you ask, well, why do we go through menopause? I mean, the really basic answer to that is, well, we make our supply of eggs up front and then we run out, so part of it is that we're living a long time. But I think that's actually not the answer either, because, oh my gosh, the thing I'm really interested in right now are the whales, not the whales that have menopause, but the whales that don't have menopause and live until they're 200. So,
Really? There are
some,
whales that live until they're 200?
yes, bowhead
Oh,
whales, these are like incredibly interesting whales. They live until they're the longest lived mammals. They live until they're 200, and people who have studied them have shown that they continue ovulating at least until they're 150 or something. I mean, they have the potential to have babies for that long. And so this is one of the directions, I think, of evolutionary biology that I think could potentially be most useful for us as humans, sort of thinking biomedically here. How are those whales doing that? Like, how are they keeping their ovaries and their eggs healthy for that long? Um, there was this beautiful piece written pretty recently in Scientific American by an evolutionary biologist, and she was arguing this same point. She was talking about giraffes, giraffes, not whales. Giraffes have these really, really long necks, obviously. And so to get blood to their brains, they have to maintain like super high blood pressure. High blood pressure is a big problem for humans, and for women during pregnancy, it's one of the main causes of maternal death, right?
yeah.
Preeclampsia, eclampsia, it's a big deal. Giraffes don't have this problem. They can maintain high blood pressure during pregnancy, running around, and they're totally healthy. So, one of the things, like sort of the research that I'm really interested in is, well, you know, how did those women, not women, how did those female giraffes or how did those female bowhead whales solve those problems over evolutionary time scales? Like, what is it that they're doing? And could we use that information for us? Could we use the information we glean from, bowhead whale ovaries to understand and perhaps intervene to keep our ovaries healthier for longer, so that instead of taking hormonal, birth control or really what I'm talking about is HRT once you've gone through menopause, is there a way to keep our ovaries making those hormones that are so critical for health after you go through menopause? Can we just keep our ovaries a little healthier for a little longer?
Please let us
Anyway.
know when you find that out. Because we all really are curious.
Right.
We're dying to know. I mean, I feel
Well,
like there's some stuff happening now with stem cells and things like that, but I feel like it's all very much in its infancy, isn't it?
yes.
Mm. Yeah. So, are there any myths or misconceptions surrounding the evolution of the female body that maybe you want to debunk? Because I feel like, or maybe there's something that you feel like there might be some sort of misconception that we all think is true or something like that that you want to share about.
I mean, I think there's a lot of myths about the female body, period, not just about the evolution of our bodies, but just our bodies, right? And I think we face a lot of health challenges. I think there's many reasons for that. One of the reasons, I think I've already mentioned this, is that research into women's health has been like chronically underfunded. Um, the research is lacking. So I think that's one reason. I think another reason is, not having this knowledge about how and why our bodies evolved. And, just as a quick example, and you've probably talked about this because I think, you talk a lot about teenage periods. You know, there's a lot of concern right now that girls are getting their first period earlier than before. Have
Yeah.
you heard about this?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
It's the ongoing saga. Yeah, for sure.
The big saga. And, you know, again, as with everything that we've talked about, I don't think there's one like clear-cut answer. Some people are worried about toxins in our environment. I think a big part of the answer is that our bodies evolved to factor in like how much energy, it's taking information about how well fed we are. And it's basically making decisions about when we should enter puberty based on that. Right.
Yeah.
So, it's obvious that we're eating a lot more than we used to. I mean, obesity is a big problem in this country. And, basically getting your first period earlier because you're eating a lot and your body is thinking that it's ready for reproduction. That's like what's supposed to happen. I mean, that's sort of evolved into our reproductive systems, is basically to sense, how much energy is going in and making that decision. Okay, it's not enough. Well, we're going to wait until times are better to start, reproducing. A lot of energy. Okay, it's time, I can have a baby now. Like, and your body, basically is ready to start cycling. And so I think, we're often like searching for, you know, some big answer. And the answer is actually really simple. We're eating our girls are eating too much. They're not moving around enough. So they're hitting puberty earlier because, our bodies evolved to take those things into account when it's deciding when to start cycling.
Right. And I do wonder, I haven't really looked too much into this, whether early puberty or puberty is arriving earlier in populations across the world. I don't know if there's a comparison, because obviously we do have a significant obesity issue in the US,
Yes.
almost more so than other industrialized nations. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah. I don't know compared to other industrialized nations, but definitely compared to, more traditional societies, we are getting our periods earlier.
Yeah.
And we know some of the science of that, like, the amount of energy you're taking in, it sends signals to your brain, your brain then, starts to send the signal to the ovaries to get it going. I mean, it's, that is pretty clear.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it sort of evolved for a reason, right? Has a purpose.
Right. Yeah. And so is there anything that you want to share about that? Like are there implications for this earlier puberty that we don't even know about yet?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, because this is not what happens in most animals. In most animals, you go through puberty at the time that you're ready to be a mother. We're at this really weird time in our society where we are hitting puberty earlier. I think a lot of that has to do with diet and lifestyle. Some of it may not. I mean, we are also exposed to lots of chemicals and whatnot. So while that is happening, it's also so much harder to be independent. I mean, you hear, I feel like I read just this morning that, adult parents are like living with their adult children for much longer. Like, it's just so much harder to become an independent adult these days. There's so much stress. It's hard to get a job. It's, all the reasons. And so you've got this sort of mismatch between when your body is ready to reproduce and when you're mature enough to have a child, right? It's definitely this big sort of mismatch. And, one of the reasons why the menopause question is so important, obviously women are waiting much longer to have their babies for, a number of reasons. but like our bodies haven't evolved to, factor that in. I mean, we want to have babies in our 40s because, we're set with our careers or whatever it is. We haven't met the person that we want to have children with. All of that is just taking longer and longer, but our bodies still run out of eggs at 50.
Right.
So, all these unique challenges that we're facing. And it's interesting. I mean, I don't have an answer for, what to do about it, but it's definitely an interesting mismatch that exists.
I don't think any of us do. And I think it's all this big experiment right now because we've never experienced these levels of stress or this exposure to environmental chemicals and various other things that are happening on a much larger scale than ever before. So yeah, we're just guinea pigs. It's what it feels like sometimes.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This was really, really enlightening. I feel like I learned a ton of information. And as I said to you in the beginning, I've really learned so much just starting to read your book. And everyone who's listening, definitely get Deena's book. Can you share a little bit more about where people can find you and your book that's going to be out really soon?
Yes. I mean, probably the best place to find me is my website. So that's deenaemera.com, and you can connect to all my socials through the website. My book, it's called A Brief History of the Female Body. It's out August 15th. You can buy it any place where you normally buy books. So Amazon, obviously, and Barnes & Noble and all the other places. And I'm just really excited to get it in your hands. Like, I just feel like it's fascinating and really will give women the context to understand their bodies better. So I hope, I hope it brings people, I hope it brings women sort of a deeper knowledge of what's happening in their own bodies.
And that's what we all want. I'm so glad that you were on the show. Thank you so much, Deena.
Thank you for having me, Nicole. That was so much fun.
That's a wrap. Be sure to click that subscribe button to join me for more Girl Talk Gone Menstrual in upcoming episodes. But in the meantime, check out my latest Period Party episode. And if you're looking for a deeper dive into your hormones, go ahead and take my period quiz at nicolejardim.com/quiz.